those steps, and he said those ugly things about persons from Mexico, as he said. He set the tone and tenor, and it has continued to degenerate and to cause people to suffer. We have a duty, a responsibility, and an obligation to stop this. This is inhumane. I have to repeat what was said. Some things bear repeating. Children, at least 85, it said 85 was the capacity. My guess more than 100, men, women, and children, stacked closer than you are, lying on top of each other, all over each other, and then having to use the facility in the presence of each other. What a disgrace! The richest country in the world. I'm not a doctor, but I know inhumanity and a need for better medical facilities when I see it. And I want to thank Dr. Ruiz. He asked the right questions at the right time, and he didn't let them off the hook. They had to answer, and we've got to answer to the American people. Mr. Chairman, I thank you.
Thank you. And Congressman Green is right. There is a mass of humanity wrapped up in foil laying on the floor in this facility. Next, I want to ask Raul Ruiz, Congressman from California, Southern California, and emergency medical room doctor, to give us his perspective.
Thank you, Chairman. Thank you for your leadership in bringing everybody here. I'm Dr. Raul Ruiz. I represent California's 36th district. I'm an board-certified emergency physician with training in humanitarian disaster aid from Harvard University and Pittsburgh Medical Center. And I think it's very important to really reflect on the loss of life that just occurred. It hits us to our most profound core, because as parents, we can only imagine the human suffering that's going on, not only with the father here, but imagine the mother in Guatemala and her children learning of the death of her daughter when she was full of hope that one day that she would live in a land of opportunity, safe from the violence and the persecution that perhaps she was facing in her country of Guatemala. And so it's very important that as members of Congress and leaders in the nation that we set the tone by coming here and making sure that the administration, the American people understand that we care so much about human dignity and human life that we will come all the way here to investigate the loss of one child, the 7-year-old child that was under the custody and the care and the responsibility of the federal government. And that's what brings us here, because as agents and individuals, representatives of the people, making sure that government works for the people, we want to make sure that our sentiments and our values are reflected in that government. And what I found here is that there are some really serious systemic obstacles and problems and failures in the system to provide the care that a child so lovingly deserves when they're in our custody. When there is a loss of life in the emergency department, we always do a debrief and we ask ourselves in deep sorrow, 1, what caused the death? 2, what could we have done differently that would have potentially helped prevent this death? And what are the lessons learned that we can do systemically to improve our ability to prevent death? And that's the approach that we're taking here to ensure that we learn from this situation. And I know that there are OIG reports, that there are other agencies that are come down, and I believe that there should be an independent investigation, a congressional investigation with further healthcare experts in order to identify what these systemic problems are. Now, when you ask yourselves what could have happened differently that could have perhaps saved this child's life, 1 is a complete vital signs and an actual physical examination on any vulnerable populations when a child comes in. You know, if it is true that the child had not eaten and was vomiting for several days, the child does not look normal when they present to the emergency department or anywhere. And a cursory physical exam to determine if the pulse is high or the fever, if she had a fever. Anybody who's dehydrated is not happy, is not excited, they look really sick. At that point, perhaps a aeromedical evacuation could have been called and she could have still been alive. The other thing is to determine whether or not she was safe to be transported, right? In a distance that would take 3 hours to get to. So you would have to do another exam, another checkup, or have the equipment that would help in case anything happened. And it did. Reports of seizures were revealed. And there were some questions as to whether or not the agents had the appropriate training in the appropriate facilities, whether or not they even had the appropriate equipment. The child was laid on a flat table. I saw the equipment that was available here. They did not have suitable pediatric equipment for IV fluids, for resuscitation, for even monitoring. They called the ambulance when one could argue that the judgment should have been to call the aeromedical evacuation. It took them from the moment of her unresponsiveness and landing here to the evacuation over, I believe, an hour. And so there are things that we need to learn, and the systemic problems that exist here. For example, the infrastructure that not only plagues the border security agents, that is for their safety as well, but also the ability to respond to emergencies. They rely on cell phones, and as you all know, they have no reception here. So how is a paramedic going to consult with their medical command at the emergency department if they can't get them on their phone? We talked about making sure that perhaps they can have access to the 911 system so that there could be a more rapid response. Making sure they have high-speed broadband so in case they need telemedicine. Making sure that they have even the basic necessities of any examination, like a bed where patients who are sick can lie on instead of a hard table. So, you know, in the process of upholding our laws and processing our laws, we can't lose our humanity. We can't lose who we are as a people, as Americans, and we have to make sure that that humanity is reflected in how we value our budget, right? How we care for our agents who are putting themselves at harm's way in protecting our nation, and making sure they have the resources, the skills, and the flexibility to respond to emergencies like this. Voy a hablar en español porque sé que algunos tienen viewers que hablan español. Mira, yo soy médico de emergencia. Lo que sucedió fue una tragedia en lo más profundo que nos duele el corazón a todos nosotros padres, que cuando veamos a nuestros hijos y lo queremos, solamente podemos imaginar el dolor que tiene una madre escuchando las noticias que se murió su hija de 7 años. Cuando esa madre tuvo la esperanza que en algún tiempo su familia iban a vivir en un lugar sin miedo, sin amenaza, con oportunidades, y luego recibiendo esa noticia nos duele a todos. Y es importante dar el mensaje a todo ciudadano, también todo inmigrante, que nosotros tenemos la humanidad y la importancia de cada vida, que nosotros venimos de diferentes partes del país para dar la investigación, para asegurarnos que esto no sucede otra vez. Y había cosas que hubieran sido, que pudieran salvar la vida a la niña. Por ejemplo, un examen físico, un examen tomando las señales de la temperatura, el pulso, el tiempo de respiraciones, y también teniendo todo el equipaje necesario para resucitar y monitorear, observar y hacer exámenes para a una niña o un bebé. O tener el equipo y la infraestructura para poder ser llamadas a diferentes personas para traer un helicóptero más pronto para poder salvar la vida, y los sistemas de transportaciones. Entonces, esas son las preguntas que nosotros estamos haciendo, estamos observando, y vamos a crear soluciones en un modo para poder evitar esto que sucede otra vez. Porque una gota de humanidad va a aliviar mucho en el sistema rota de la inmigración que tenemos, y necesitamos esa gota de humanidad de ayudarnos para evitar esta tragedia que sucede otra vez. Muchas gracias.
I'd like to invite now Veronica Escobar, who's Congresswoman-elect for El Paso.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank all of you for being here and for shedding light on what is happening here on the U.S.-Mexico border. I am so grateful to my future colleagues and to the leadership of the chairman for coming down to El Paso and to southern New Mexico to bear witness to much of what we in this community and in the El Paso community have borne witness to for a long time. I think that it's important to again reiterate that the tragedy has been very heartbreaking, and that today has been a very sad day for us. To see more children, more families who are put in concrete rooms in conditions that many of us believe are inhumane and that are not reflective of the America that all of us know we can and should be. You know, the reality of what is happening today is a result of changes in the world. And we had this conversation with the CBP commissioner about how families really have replaced single men in coming across our border to seek refuge in the arms of our country. It's no longer necessarily simply economic migration that we're seeing, but we're seeing asylum seekers who are running for their lives, who are trying to save the lives of their families. These are not criminals, these are not people trying to do us harm. The families that we have seen today are people just like you and I, people who are looking for a better life, people who are looking for hope, and who unfortunately end up finding almost as much misery when they cross our borders as the misery that they fled. We have to do a better job in our country of taking care of one another, regardless of country of origin, and regardless of where we stand on the law enforcement spectrum, because my colleagues and I were just as concerned for Border Patrol and CBP agents as we were, obviously, for the asylum seekers. We want a system that is safe and a system that protects everyone and recognizes everyone's humanity. That's going to take a lot of hard work. That's going to take a lot of hard work to getting to the root causes of why families are running to America. We need to understand that, and we need to address that. But when they come into our custody, we also have to recognize that we as a country have been criminalizing migration for a long time. And it's gotten to the point where people are dying in greater numbers, and where we are spending far more money on incarceration than we are on family reunification or actually addressing the challenges. If we take a look at the amount of money that has been appropriated over the last decade, the focus has been on securing the border. And that's been a very broad term. And unfortunately, sometimes that term, and by certain individuals and certainly by this administration, has been used as a club to do harm to migrants, to use deterrence as a weapon and to use cruelty as a way to deter. It is going to be up to Congress and the American people, and frankly the American voters, to recognize that we are better than this, and that we have to do better than this. You know, one last thing that I will say is, when you look at the battle that's been taking place in Washington, D.C. over a border wall, it represents some very skewed priorities. Dr. Ruiz laid out ways that we can invest. Al Green laid out ways that we can invest. After this fact-finding mission, where we essentially have followed the same journey as Jacqueline and her father, we all have ways that we can invest in a better, more humane system. Walls won't create that humane system. We have a wall, it hasn't kept people out. It has only, as the chairman said, pushed people out to more treacherous crossings. We need to learn lessons that have been deadly lessons and that have been tragic lessons, And that is why I am so grateful to my future colleagues for being here and shedding light on these lessons. I'm grateful to the journalists here. We need your help in continuing to shed light on all of this. Thank you.
Next, I'd like to invite up Lou Correa, Congressman from California.
Thank you very much. You know, it's sad that Jacqueline's death, had to happen to bring all of us here again to refocus on the issue of the border and the border wall. And I say that with anger because as I think at Washington, what's going on right now, and we're talking about shutting down government unless we get a border wall. And I got to say, pull back a little bit. I just finished talking to management in there, and I just finished talking to border agents. And I asked them, what's going on? And they've told me, they said, in a very short time, we're going from stopping interdicting drugs to addressing asylum seekers, families. And they've told me, we're not ready. We don't have the facilities, very overcrowded. We don't have the trained personnel, EMTs. And when I said, what about the border wall? They said, we want better equipment, more personnel. We want to do our job. They said, that's what a border wall should be. Now, I got to tell you, none of those border agents are going to come out and say, this is my name, and this is what I think about the border wall. But their message is clear. We in Washington have to do our job. And our job is to take care of this country and to make sure that we take care of those asylum seekers. If I go back, when I do go back to Washington, I'm going to go and do my job. I sit on Homeland Security, and I'm going to make sure we have hearings on this issue. I thank the press. It's important that the people of America find out what's going on here in this part of the country. Thank you.
Thank you, Lou. Next, we'll have Sylvia Garcia, Congresswoman-elect from Houston, Texas.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and again, thank you for your leadership, and thank you to all my colleagues that are joining us here today. I just want to underscore 2 points. Number one, as Congressman Green said, this first, beyond everything, is a human tragedy. Today is International Migrant Day. Think about that. And here we are talking about a young angel, 7 years old, who died here in the process of just trying to come here for a better life. Think about the father who had to carry her into that small room, Dr. Reese, so small, I think my closet is probably larger, put on a hard table where now sits 2 microwaves, not a bed, and that's where she was determined to be so ill. But also think about the mother who they had to find and give her word that her daughter has died, the daughter that she thought she was waving goodbye to come to a better world here in America. It's a human tragedy, but it's one of our own making. That's why we as members of Congress have to take responsibility and provide the oversight and the independent investigation that's necessary to get down to the bottom line. We have to look at this independently, from top to bottom, unfettered, transparent, so that the public can hear and know all the facts. I saw so many inconsistencies in some of the statements that were made today. As the chairman kept reminding us, there's still a bigger mystery. Frankly, I have more questions now than I feel like I got answers, because so often they were just being evasive. But the bottom line is, let's not forget Jacqueline, but let's get to the bottom of this to make sure that this just never ever happens again in this country. Thank you.
And finally, we have from Chicago, Congressman-elect Chuy Garcia.
Thank you, Chairman, y muy buenas tardes. As an immigrant boy who came through El Paso 53 years ago, I was moved to come with the Hispanic congressional delegation and our friends and allies today by the death of Jacqueline. I was moved because I wanted to get answers to the questions that have surfaced over the past week and a half since her death. But instead of finding answers, we leave here today asking more questions. especially the question of why the government agency responsible for caring for people who are in their custody has failed to adapt, to innovate, to be flexible, and to respond to the basic needs of little children, of families, mothers, and fathers in their custody. What we saw today was clearly an example of the lack of competency and the lack of resource investment to be able to respond adequately to this humanitarian crisis. It is a truly emotional day to see how human beings are being held here and how slow we are to adapt our response to this humanitarian crisis. Yes, we await the report of the Inspector General. Yes, we await the report on the autopsy, but it is clear that an independent investigation is warranted, and we will work for that as we consult the full caucus. But in addition to that, it is very clear that if we're to get at the root of why people are forced to leave their lands and their homelands, that we need a multinational, especially a binational effort to get at the roots of why people are having to leave the countries where they were born. Muy brevemente en español. Como un inmigrante miembro del siguiente Congreso de los Estados Unidos, yo vine de Chicago como vinieron congresistas de costa a costa hoy por la tragedia, la muerte de Jacqueline Cal. Hoy venimos aquí para conocer de primera mano las condiciones dentro de las cuales están siendo tratados los y las migrantes. Y lo que vimos es que existe una agencia federal que no tiene la capacidad ni los recursos para atender la crisis humanitaria que se vive aquí en la frontera. Por esa razón, el caucus hispano va a seguir indagando, investigando. Esperamos el informe del inspector general, pero al mismo tiempo exigimos que haya una investigación independiente para llegar a la verdad y a la raíz de esta crisis. Al mismo tiempo, creemos que lo que se requiere aquí es un esfuerzo multinacional para llegar a la raíz de lo que forza a la gente a migrar a nuestro país. Muchas gracias.
All right, y'all. We'll take some questions.
Were you able to meet with the agents involved?
No. I put in a request. I spoke to CBP Commissioner McAleenan twice. The second time I spoke with him, I asked him to be able to speak with the agents on this trip. He said at that time that we would not be able to visit with the agents, and I believe that Speaker-designate Pelosi also reached out to him to make the same request. They did make a supervisor, he's Supervisor Stokes, I believe, who was one of the supervisors on duty during the time that this incident occurred, but we didn't get to speak directly to the agents involved.
You said there was no running water and only 2 restrooms. Was that in both facilities?
So at Antelope Wells, the water had been shut off. It's clear that the water, what was reported to us, has been contaminated based on the most recent annual report. No running water, and 2 porta potties that were outside. Here at this facility, it's clear that there is running water, but again, the bathroom facilities that the undocumented immigrants, that the asylum seekers are using is in a crowded room, overcrowded, that is out in the open.
What do you mean by contaminated? Groundwater? Was it lead? What do you mean? What does that report say?
We're not aware of the report. We've asked for the report, but what was suggested was metals and bacteria in the water. We did not see any running water ourselves, so could not speak to the color.
What is the most pressing need you have and where will the money come from?
I'm sorry?
What is the most pressing need you have right now and where will the money come from?
Well, I think the most pressing need is to make sure that this doesn't happen again. And we talked about some of the systemic failures and shortcomings. Dr. Raul Reese spoke about some of the medical shortcomings, the fact that they didn't have the training, the personnel, the supplies, or the equipment to deal with this kind of situation, either at Antelope Wells or on the bus ride or here at Lordsburg. So it's all of that. And in the next several days and weeks, we're going to be coming up with the policy recommendations that we believe, need to happen in order to improve this. And let me address the
Border Patrol is also hiring a lot of folks right now, and we want to see if we can change the criteria from going from certain hiring requirements to those that also require that folks be medically trained to address these emerging issues. So you have a set of issues or requirements that you had before, now a totally new emerging environment, and I think we need to make sure those new border agents can address the emerging challenges.
Well, let me make one more comment with respect to that. When we have a president who's emphasizing building a wall, spending billions of dollars in building a wall, when the lives of asylum seekers, and I would argue Border Patrol agents, are at stake because of a lack of infrastructure, a lack of training, a lack of supplies, a lack of equipment, then you can tell that it's a president whose priorities are very misplaced, and really a president who's completely out of touch with what's happening at CBP and the realities on the ground.
Congressman, this is obviously a very extraordinary situation, a tragic one. They're dealing with 163 on the night that Jacqueline came across, 200 the last 2 nights. Obviously, you've talked about people coming to seek asylum. Is there anything in our current legal framework that is attracting an unusually high number of people who are coming here, who are, as they say, trying to take advantage of legal gaps in our current law? Or do you believe that all of these people are fleeing violence and deserve asylum?
Well, the asylum decisions are made on an individual case basis. Look, I think that what's going on now in this period in time in history in the United States is the same thing that went on with the Irish who came here in big waves, and Germans who came here in big waves, and other ethnic groups. I think that it's no different.
And let me say that in the 1980s, we had more asylum seekers from Central America. This is a wake-up call that the circumstances in Central America have not changed. And like some of my colleagues said, we need to go into Central America and address the issues of violence, instability, political corruption, lack of economic opportunity, and fix them. After World War II, it was our best interest to stabilize Germany and Europe with a Marshall Plan. It is in our best national interest to stabilize the Americas as well. We need to start focusing on the basics.
We have time for one more question because we have to get on the road.
The criticism has been of the Trump administration that its immigration policy is forcing people into these more remote areas. But that's been going on for some time for various reasons. What is different about this particular situation that is forcing people?
Well, I mean, we can only go by what we're being told by CBP. And they've said that, for example, there were another over 200 folks that showed up this morning, very early this morning, in the morning hours. So they tell us that for this area and for the more rural parts, that it's an unusual occurrence. So we believe that a big part of the reason for that is because of the change in policy by the Trump administration.
Congressman, do you think the commissioner should resign over this?
I'll answer that in a second.
We have a policy of rejecting the humanitarian crisis rather than accepting it and dealing with it. Since the Syrian war, we have spent over $1 billion to Jordan to help them manage the crisis. When we had the Cubans fleeing Cuba, we created a policy that allowed persons to just get 1 foot on American soil and then move on to a pathway to citizenship. We have not addressed the humanitarian crisis. We're still dealing with a law enforcement solution to a humanitarian crisis. We have to change our vision of what we're dealing with. And until we change our vision, we're going to continue to see circumstances like this. My final point to you is this. The only reason this facility is still open as it is now is because these cameras can't get in. If one of your cameras could get in there, the public would see what we have seen, and we would shut this down, or we would restructure it so that it could treat human beings in a decent fashion.
Chairman, can I address the port issue real
Sure.
quick? Thank you. So to your question about kind of what's changing, in addition to seeing more families, many of you have documented, and I have been an eyewitness to the fact that we have Customs Border Protection agents at the top of our ports of entry where the U.S. and Mexico meet, essentially preventing asylum seekers from lawfully stepping foot on American soil so that they can seek asylum protection. And what we've seen happen since the summer in El Paso is families that have been camped out on the Mexican side of the port of entry who have been moved deeper into Mexico, and then now we have the metering system and the writing of numbers on the forearm. We've also seen, and these are legitimate challenges, but this administration is addressing these challenges in the cruelest way, in a way that in fact makes things much worse. And so, for example, the unaccompanied minors at Tornillo, instead of allowing sponsors to come and claim their children, many of these folks, many of these kids are being used as bait, so that as their sponsors come forward and get fingerprinted, if they are undocumented, they're being apprehended. And so the population at Tornillo continues to grow. So my point is, a challenge that we're facing as a country is being exacerbated and made far worse by this administration.
Let me answer that one question, and this will be our last comment because we have to get on the road. I had the opportunity to speak to CBP Commissioner McAleenan twice. I know other members have not had the opportunity to speak with him, have not had the opportunity to visit these facilities, and also investigate and inquire about the death of this young girl. Based on my conversations with him, based on his conduct, I believe that he should step down. I believe that would be the best course of action at this time. We have also asked the question, when was Secretary Nielsen, his direct boss, made aware of Jacqueline's death? And if she was made aware of the death before Congress was, why she didn't report to Congress that this had occurred. As he mentioned to us earlier, this is a rare occurrence, the death of a young girl in Border Patrol custody. And he said that he didn't want to politicize the death in front of Congress. But because it's such a rare occurrence, that makes it arguably the most significant thing that could have been discussed that morning. We also, even today, although Commissioner McAleenan, some of the top brass, certainly the agents here, were very willing to have conversations about all kinds of policy and practices. The commissioner rode over with us on the bus for an hour and a half and openly took our questions, heard our concerns, and talked about some of his concerns. But in all of that, it's clear that many of these facilities, not just the ones that we visited, are under-resourced, that there's a lack of training, a lack of equipment, and that all of that adds up to bad priorities or wrong priorities.
Does he share those concerns?
I'm going to let him speak for himself, but we were on the same page on some of the things that we spoke about. You know, we had at times a very, obviously very lively, but sometimes contentious conversations. I'm not just speaking about myself, but all of us in the group. And so you asked me the question whether I think he should resign. If I was the head of DHS, I would ask him to step down. Thank you.